The Israeli army has stepped up its operations in northern Gaza, pounding the area with airstrikes and encircling Gaza City. Israel Defense Forces are expected to enter the city soon. They have been preparing for urban warfare with the Islamist militant group Hamas, which is likely to lead to a sharp rise in casualties. The Israeli troops have already severed Gaza City from the south of the territory. For more, I'm now joined by DW correspondent Ben Fajzullin, who is in Jerusalem. Ben, it is 1 month now since Hamas terrorists attacked Israel, murdered more than 1,400 people, and abducted more than 230 people to Gaza. How are Israelis remembering today?
It's going to be a day of mixed feelings, a full day of remembrance with flags flying at half-mast right now. I'm just a stone's throw away from the gates to East Jerusalem, to the Old City, where there will be vigils held by Palestinians and Israelis together to remember all those who've died so far during this conflict. But I'm right in front of one of the vigils where people have been lighting candles just moments ago, and you can see the posters of those who were kidnapped. But as I say, there are also, this is going to be a day of mixed feelings. There are also going to be protests outside the entrance to the Knesset, the parliament. People are also angry about the government's response, also the government's performance leading up until this time, the surveillance records of the government, and the fact that there were security lapses and that this happened at all.
Security lapses, to say the least. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu has expressed openness, at least in theory, to tactical pauses. Can you tell us anything more about that?
Well, the general mood here is also for no ceasefire, and Mr. Netanyahu has made that extremely clear. There's talk of there being a temporary truce or a humanitarian pause. Is really only talk at the moment. There have been demands from Arab leaders for this, but until all hostages are returned, this is not going to be on the table as far as Mr. Netanyahu goes.
In an interview with the U.S. news network ABC, Netanyahu made significant comments about Gaza. Let's listen in.
Those who don't want to continue the way of Hamas, it certainly is not. I think Israel will, for an indefinite period, will have the overall security responsibility, because we've seen what happens when we don't have it. When we don't have that security responsibility, what we have is the eruption of Hamas terror on a scale that we couldn't imagine.
Ben, Netanyahu there saying the country will take responsibility over the Gaza Strip after destroying Hamas. What exactly does he mean?
This is the most interesting development we've had in days as far as the political side of this debate goes. And it's the first time we've heard any sort of mention from Netanyahu about a plan the day after the war, that is, because there's been a lot of criticism as to Netanyahu's response, sending in these forces now in full force, but without a plan for what's going to happen afterwards. The Palestinian Authority, which is in a very weak position right now, has been suggested by U.S. Secretary of State Blinken to be revived, revitalized, and to take over control of the Gaza Strip. There are a lot of doubts about whether or not it can do that. The other suggestion has been a group of countries and international agencies to provide governance and security for the Gaza Strip. But as you heard there, it sounds like Benjamin Netanyahu wants to do that.
That is DW's Ben Fajzullin reporting from Jerusalem. Many thanks, Ben. I'd like to now welcome Frank Ledwidge, a senior lecturer in strategic studies at Portsmouth University and a former UK military intelligence officer. Frank, Israeli troops have encircled Gaza City and are preparing to push into the city center. Do we have any idea how many Hamas fighters they're expecting to confront there?
Well, good morning, Michael. I think we don't have an idea of that, but I'm absolutely certain that there is probably fairly accurate assessment on the part of the intelligence officers of the 36th Division of the Israeli army, the most powerful armoured unit they have, who are about to enter. So I can't really speculate on that. The overall context is that there are 20 or 30,000 within Gaza, the enclave itself, but there's no way of telling how many in Gaza City. I would suspect there are going to be a fairly high number, as they will want to make a stand. The Israeli projection is that this particular phase of the operation for Gaza City will take months, not weeks.
It is, in fact, existential for Hamas, so I take your point. Israel's made it repeatedly clear their goal is the destruction of Hamas, in particular its leadership and their headquarters in Gaza City. Does the IDF believe Hamas leaders are, in fact, still there?
They say that they have, over the last 4 weeks or so, probably the last 2 weeks really, killed in the region of 30 senior commanders. That's brigade commanders. That's commanders of about 300 or 400, and battalion commanders 100 or so. The numbers are different than Western armies, which would indicate that they do believe that some of the leadership is there. Now, one of the functions of cordoning off the northern Gaza area into the northern sector of operations is to seal off Hamas leadership and, of course, personnel who are already there, and kill them, or capture them, I suppose, in some cases. And I've no doubt at all that the assumption is that there is significant elements of Hamas leadership there. Of course, the overall leadership is in Qatar, although there are operational commanders, Deif, for example, who are still certainly in Gaza now.
The Israeli army is advancing into the city with the 36th Division. We understand some of the best trained personnel in the IDF. What more can you tell us about this division?
It's one of the older units in the Israeli army. It's what the Americans would call a storied unit, with battle honours going way back into the 50s and late 40s, I think. But I think it's important to bear one thing in mind, or many things really, but one thing particularly is the power of this unit. So to put things in context, it has combat power comparable, combat power, not numbers here, so the numbers is probably between 10 and 20,000, plus support and logistics. But the combat power is similar to that of the British Army. So that one division, there are 8 or 9 reserve and regular divisions in the Israeli army divided into brigades, but the 36th Division has combat power equivalent to the British Army. So that when you see those pictures of these awe-inspiring, shock and awe barrages, not only from the air and artillery, that's what you're seeing. You're seeing the power of a large, modern, well-equipped army and its most powerful division about to go into action. Like I say, just to stress, by Western European standards, it's an extremely powerful unit, very well equipped.
Frank, I'm curious, if the Israeli army succeeds in taking over Gaza City, what does it mean for the progress of this war? Is it essentially over, or will they face something like what the American forces confronted after toppling Baghdad, a smattering but persistent resistance of guerrilla forces hiding among the local population?
I have no doubt whatsoever that they will. And this fed into the decision by Netanyahu, I think, over the last, or expressed over the last day, for Israel to take control of this, because there's no appetite whatsoever on the part of the Arab countries who talk a great game but do very little with respect to security in that particular region, and even less, I think, with the British, the French and the Americans, who I think have had quite enough of occupying hostile areas in the Middle East. So that essentially left only the Israelis. And of course, the Israelis will be facing, undoubtedly, as you put it, desultory guerrilla action when and if, well, when they take this area. The question for me, and I don't know the answer to this, is what, as you said, what will they do then? Will they then start grinding south? Will they start incrementally going south? Which would put a huge pressure, of course, on the population and resources. We don't know the answer to that yet. But for now, the question is, how long will this take? The answer is this phase, months.
Reminds me of what former Secretary of State Colin Powell said. He said, you break it, you own it, when he was talking about Iraq, of course. That is Frank Ledwidge, Senior Lecturer in Strategic Studies at Portsmouth University and a former UK military intelligence officer. Many thanks, as always, Frank.
Thank you, Michael.
Let's now bring in Shaina, a communication advisor with the Norwegian Refugee Council. based in Jerusalem. Shaina, the UN chief, Antonio Guterres, says nowhere is safe in Gaza. Very few would know this better than your own team on the ground there. What are they telling you?
So we have a staff of 54 trapped inside of Gaza. Most of our staff has fled from the north to the center and south of Gaza. But as you said, no place is safe. Just this morning, I spoke to my colleague Yusuf, who's in Khan Yunis, who told me that there was an airstrike on a building very close to where he was sleeping around 6 a.m. this morning. Day after day, we are hearing from our colleagues that even those who have fled, that the south is not safe. We've had colleagues lose family members in the south, including one of our colleagues, Amal, whose 7-year-old son Khalid was killed in an airstrike on Rafah a couple of weeks ago. And what we're hearing in addition is not just is it not safe in the south, but similar to the north, people now are struggling to find basic necessities, food, clean water, even waiting in line 5-6 hours a day just to get half a portion of bread.
The Palestinian Red Crescent says that aid deliveries into Gaza are much lower now than before the war. I'm afraid it's a question we'll keep asking until there's significant change on the ground. But how dire is the humanitarian situation today?
Each day, it seems to be getting worse and worse. Just 2 days ago, I spoke to a couple of my colleagues who told me that they hadn't been able to find any water that day and were resorting to drinking cola because they had no alternatives. We are struggling, even in our aid distribution that we're working on, to find water and procure water to distribute to those who have been internally displaced. Day after day, we're hearing that it's getting to be even more of a struggle to find these basic goods. And until there's a huge ramping up of the assistance going into Gaza, people throughout all of Gaza are going to continue to suffer. The important thing also to note is while we need a huge increase in the amount of aid going in, I think we had 92 trucks yesterday, which still fell short of the 100 trucks minimum that the UN has said is needed in Gaza, is we need fuel to be in order to be able to distribute that aid throughout all of Gaza and reaching the few 100,000 people who remain in northern Gaza. And we also need a ceasefire in order to assure that humanitarians can go and distribute that aid and people seeking assistance can go and access that aid safely and without concerns that they will be killed while seeking out aid.
Understood. Your organization is one of many asking for a ceasefire. 1 month after the conflict started, what are your hopes?
You know, it feels hopeless day after day, but we need to keep pushing the international community to demand a ceasefire. Palestinians in Gaza cannot take it any longer. Each day, our colleagues tell us, is the worst day of their lives, and the next day turns out to be harder than the previous one. A ceasefire cannot come soon enough. We need an end to this madness. We need an end to these hostilities. We need an end to the killing and displacement. Really, I cannot stress how much we are praying and hoping for a ceasefire, despite the fact that we're hearing resistance coming from Israeli authorities.
Our thanks to Shaina Lowe from the Norwegian Refugee Council for your time and your perspective.
Thank you.
Well, the European Union says it is stepping up its delivery of aid to Gaza. So for more on this, let's bring in DW correspondent Rosie Birchard, who is standing by for us at an airport in Belgium, Ostend-Bruges Airport, where a plane with aid is preparing to depart. Good morning to you, Rosie. Good to see you. So tell us, what aid is actually being sent?
Yeah, good morning from Ostend near the Belgian coast. And behind me, that plane is getting filled up with humanitarian aid. Mostly what I've been told is it's nutritional supplements, so food to get to people, and also health supplies, so medicines, equipment for hospitals, which we're told is really, there's a dire need for it. Now, that plane will be bound for Egypt, where it will be taken, the stocks will be taken by the Egyptian Red Crescent and then into Gaza. Now, the EU says it has, over the past month, essentially quadrupled its humanitarian aid for Palestinians. And we've heard from the EU Commissioner this morning here at this airport saying that the humanitarian situation in Gaza is dire. I asked him if he had a message for people there, and he said he wanted to let them know that the EU has not forgotten about them and will stand by their side.
Right, well, getting aid shipped is naturally a good start, Rosie, but how effectively is this reaching people in Gaza?
Well, I spoke to a representative of the Red Cross here, and he summed it up really clearly. He said, well, no aid is any use if it's stuck in a truck. And so far, the figures that we've been given here this morning are that several hundred trucks of aid have been able to enter Gaza through that Rafah crossing over the past few weeks. But that was described to me by this humanitarian worker as simply a drop in the ocean. And we also had a persistent call, a renewed call from the EU's humanitarian aid chief saying there needs to be more humanitarian access. There is not enough. There's not enough ways for them to get aid in. So the fact that more aid is being sent, obviously the EU wants to send that message of support, but also they say they're continuing to press, they say all parties, to try and get more access so that more aid can actually make it to those people in that dire need, as described here by EU officials.
Now, the United Nations has insisted on a ceasefire. Where does the European Union stand on that?
Well, the European Union is divided. You might have heard me say this on many other topics, but really on this one, EU countries have been battling over this, really negotiating down to every single detail of every single word. Officially, the EU, the European Council, so that's the member states, have called for humanitarian pauses and corridors for humanitarian needs, so essentially pauses in fighting to let aid in. Now, the Commissioner here this morning, who represents the European Commission, so that's the executive arm of the European Union, said it doesn't matter which word you use, whether it's a pause, whether it's a corridor, whether it's a ceasefire, but of course for a divided group of member states, words really do matter, and the EU is still pretty much at odds over this, even if they have managed to negotiate some statements so far. Now, there have also been what was first described as a kind of muddled response. There was an announcement weeks ago, just in the direct aftermath of the attacks, that there would be a suspension of certain development payments, and that was then backtracked on. So a somewhat muddled response so far, but certainly officials here this morning trying to send one message of support to, they say, the people in Gaza.
Thanks, Rosie. DW correspondent Rosie Birchard at Belgium's Ostend Bruges airport.